Newsmakers and market movers. This is The Pulse with Francine Lacqua.
Well, good morning, everyone, and welcome to The Pulse. I'm Francine Lacqua, live from the Munich Security Conference today. These are your top stories. The future of Ukraine hangs in the balance here in Munich as European leaders consider their role in negotiations after Donald Trump's phone call to Vladimir Putin. A 50% cut in defense spending. Donald Trump floats the idea of a deal with Russia and China as a way to radically reduce military budgets. Plus, signs of tariff fatigue, while Bloomberg's dollar index actually slides to a 2-month low as investors wind back bets that President Trump will ramp up levies. Well, we have a really packed show. We have a host of top guests this hour, including the Singaporean Defense Minister, the EU's Economy Commissioner, Valdis Dombrovskis, and then, of course, a little bit later on, we also have a great panel here at the Munich Security Conference on the future of the U.S.-Ukraine security cooperation with the Ukrainian President Vladimir Zelensky and U.S. senators, including Lindsey Graham, Jen Shaheen, and John Cornyn. So there's quite a lot going on here in Munich. Donald Trump setting the wheels in motion for peace talks between Russia and Ukraine, starting with his call with Vladimir Putin. This, of course, has left European officials feeling blindsided, with concerns being raised about their ability to shoulder the cost of supporting Kyiv through negotiations and rebuilding Ukraine's military. Well, I'm delighted to be joined by Anja Manuel, former diplomat and executive director now of the Aspen Security Forum. Anja, as always, thank you so much for trying to make us smarter on all of the diplomacy that's going on behind the scenes. Do you worry? Is this a historic moment for cooperation between the U.S. and Europe?
This is a historic moment. It may not be cooperative immediately, but I do think you need to, everyone should take a step back here at the Munich Security Conference, and instead of focusing on the minute-by-minute headlines coming out of Washington, and I understand there are a lot of them, focus on the trends that are consistent. And I'd give you 3 important ones. One, from previous presidents to Biden to now President Trump, there has been a call by Americans to say our allies must do more. We cannot do these long, faraway wars by ourselves. The American people are sick of it. We're going to need the allies to step up. That's okay. Trump may say it less diplomatically, but it's a trend that continues. So that's one. 2, our southern border needs to be secure. Immigration has really become an issue. It's now a bipartisan issue. So to the extent that you hear the president talk about immigration issues, those things are going to be ongoing. And 3, I know there's a lot of talk about Russia here. China is front of mind for a lot of people in foreign policy circles in the United States, and continues to be a bipartisan, fairly hawkish consensus on China. There's real worries that under Xi Jinping, China has become increasingly authoritarian, increasingly pushing out of its boundaries in a way that worries all of us.
And there's very clear anxiousness amongst European leaders that actually the U.S. with Russia will redraw the map. And this is being zoned in on when it comes to Ukraine. We're seeing conflicting messages, frankly, from the Trump administration, depending on who you speak to. Does it take time for real policy to come through? Like, how do you cut through the noise?
Yeah, every administration, the beginnings of an administration are really complicated. No one is in their seats yet. There are a lot of really good people that are going into the Trump foreign policy establishment. Marco Rubio, head of CIA, Mike Waltz, who's running the National Security Council, Keith Kellogg, who's here leading on Ukraine. Those are really good, smart, seasoned people, very thoughtful. The president is someone who likes to make big announcements and then see if a deal can get done. So I think you're seeing here a lot of announcements being made, but behind the scenes, I think you'll see some more careful and thoughtful diplomacy.
We're also expecting at 2 p.m. the speech by J.D. Vance. It's very difficult to know what's in it. But again, there's a murmur in the corridors at the Munich Security Conference that it will be more like a wrecking ball. Can Europe and NATO still count on the U.S. as a key ally?
Of course you can count on the United States as a key ally, but alliances are a real partnership. And I think president after president has said, look, we're spending 3.5% of our GDP on military European countries. We've gotten more countries to 2%, but boy, we're not quite where we need to be. So the Trump administration will say it more aggressively than maybe a previous administration would have. but the sense remains the same, that if it's going to be an alliance and a partnership, it needs to be a true partnership.
Anja, I know you spend a lot of time trying to understand China's thinking in all of this. How are they looking at this conversation between Russia and the U.S.? How are they looking at Ukraine and the Middle East?
Well, I wouldn't want to speak for the Chinese. They're here. I'm sure you'll be interviewing them. When Chinese officials have spoken to me in the last few weeks, trying to figure out how to approach this new administration, I have said what I would say here, which is help us. You know, there doesn't need to be a war in Ukraine that's killing hundreds of thousands of people. China is a big power on the world stage. They can use that power for good. And if they can use their good offices behind the scenes to get a lasting, sustainable peace that's right for the Ukrainian people, then that's a good thing.
You know what I feel is very different from other administrations is that between the deal and diplomacy, there's quite a fine line. So you don't really know ever what the end game is. Like we've seen, you know, with Greenland, what we've seen with maybe minerals in Ukraine. How do you navigate that?
I think in all of these pronouncements, there's a core element of truth. And that's the thing to focus on. So if you talk about Greenland, all the headlines were Trump wants to take over Greenland. I think when you dig beneath the surface, there's a real concern in the Arctic about what the Russians and the Chinese in particular are doing. I think the Russians has dozens of icebreakers. I think the U.S. and NATO together have something like 2. There are real concerns about security. There are real concerns about critical minerals and where are we going to get them if the Chinese keep cutting off our supply. So if you look instead of where the ball is bouncing, but where the broad trajectory is, I think we can get to some reasonable solutions.
Where do you think Europe can actually either push back or negotiate? You know, this is a region that is extremely splintered.
Yes.
You have elections in a couple of weeks in Germany. France is also kind of on the brink. How difficult is it going to be to have a united front?
It is difficult, but I hope we don't see it as a U.S. front versus a Europe front. I think we are often separated by the tyranny of petty differences. There's so much that the U.S. and Europe have in common, even with the Trump administration, which I know is difficult for some Europeans. But if you look at, for example, I gave you 3 big trends that are consistent. A fourth one is technology is going to continue to be front and center. J.D. Vance comes from the technology world. A lot of people going to the Trump administration come from that world. And there's an area where the U.S. and Europe could do more to collaborate, building out these data centers, building out the AI ecosystem that we all need, the U.S. and Europe together.
And do you think on AI, it's going to be a real race between the U.S. and China, especially after the news a couple of weeks ago on DeepSeek?
That is the current race. There are a lot of others. I live out in Silicon Valley, so I see this up close. Wow, this technology is moving really quickly. It's moving really quickly in the U.S., in the Middle East, in China, in France, in certain ways. So I wouldn't count Europe out of all this. And this isn't going to be a have and have-nots. This technology is going to be diffused to everyone and help everyone. The question for me is, how can we do it at speed, at scale, but also making sure we have really basic safeguards, like the national security safeguards to ensure that AI doesn't intersect with bioweapons, chemical weapons, cyber in a way that makes us less safe.
But was DeepSeek, I mean, the timing of DeepSeek was actually quite convenient. Was it almost a message, a political message, a geopolitical message, because it's open source and it's kind of saying like, hey, don't disregard China right now?
Ah, interesting. Look, I don't know. What I've heard from Chinese friends and Chinese sources is that this wasn't a big Chinese government push to have DeepSeek. I think they were as surprised as the rest of the world was. And it just shows you how fast this technology is moving, how more and more is possible with less and less compute. By the way, DeepSeek wasn't trained on $5 million. That was maybe the final training run. So there's a lot that's still unknown. But no, I don't think this was the Chinese government saying, hey, look at us. They're running fast. We're running fast. The whole world is running fast.
Anja, thank you so much for joining us. I know you have to go to a panel. Anja Manuel, they're the executive director at the Aspen Security Forum. Plenty more to come. We discuss Trump, tariffs with Bloomberg's head of economics and government, Stephanie Flanders. That's next. And this is Bloomberg. On February 23rd, Germany heads to the polls following the collapse of Chancellor Scholz's coalition. With the focus on the economy,
migration, and geopolitical tensions, how will the German balance of power shift? Bloomberg Television has continuing coverage leading up to the election and will bring you the results after the votes are tallied with a special post-election broadcast. Tune in February 23rd, starting at 5 p.m. London time. Only on Bloomberg. Context changes everything.
Welcome back, everyone. Now, U.S. President Donald Trump has ordered his administration to consider imposing reciprocal tariffs on numerous trading partners. The development raises a prospect of a wider campaign against the global system that he says is tilted against the U.S. Now, Stephanie Flanders, Bloomberg's head of economics and government, joins us with the very latest. Stephanie, it's a good job you're head of government and economics. The two worlds are colliding more and more. What's the main message the Trump administration is trying to send to Europe and the world this week?
Well, I think we've seen in the last 48 hours he's just willing to and quite keen to turn things upside down in the space of a very short time. So even though we feel like it's been a very fast-moving first couple of weeks of the administration, we were expecting something from Ukraine, and then the sort of jaw-dropping nature of the developments overnight, and then to combine that with tariffs, which actually, if you're a European Union, this talk of the reciprocity and his talk about how the European, he views European value-added taxes and all countries that have value-added taxes as actually taxes on US exports, just the same as a tariff. That is a sort of dual threat to Europe. Not only is he saying, I'm going to cut you out of negotiations over Ukraine, but insist that you still pay for supporting Ukraine afterwards, I'm also going to pose this potentially very large threat in terms of tariffs. And I'm going to divide and rule. I think that's the other terrifying thing for them, that the way he's approaching this is very much looking to a country-by-country basis, which I think they've always been nervous about. How
difficult is it for Europe when you walk, this is my first Munich Security Conference, and actually when you walk the corridors, people are genuinely worried. They said, you know, J.D. Vance could be a wrecking ball in his speech today. We don't really know quite to expect. Do you think the Europeans can come together and if not fight back, at least negotiate as one?
I think I almost have this image in my mind. It's not even just coming together. It's like, who are you going to shove out the door to talk to him? Because that's the fundamental problem they have, right? They don't have, I mean, it's the old Kissinger question of if you want to talk to Europe, who do I call? But it's like, if I want to do a deal with Europe, what opposite number that I respect can I call? That's the kind of question that's coming out of Donald Trump. And it's fairly clear that, Ursula von der Leyen has a very different style. She's not that person. Who is going to be if this is the way that Donald Trump wants to do deals, and they don't want to have the European Union be divided and doing individual deals, which I think in the economic realm Donald Trump might actually quite like, who is the one person who's going to speak for Europe?
I mean, to the famous, there's always that joke, for the French position, press 1. From the German position, press 2, which makes it very, very complicated. Now, at Bloomberg Economics, which you also, of course, run, you're crunching numbers to give us a perspective of if these tariffs really are put in place or if they even go higher, what it means for GDP, but also defense spending if the U.S. pulls out.
Yes, and of course, we don't have clarity on what the numbers would be on the tariffs, but I think there's a sort of principle at stake here. I mean, remember, the way the global tax trading system has worked by and large over many decades is if you have one tariff against one country, it's also against every other country. If you start going country by country, which is, again, very much close to Donald Trump's way of doing things, you're looking at the specific set of tariffs and regulations that each country has. Now, broadly, our assessment, Maeva Cousin, our senior trade and Eurozone economist, has assessed that if he focuses just on tariffs, actually it's developing countries that will do very badly from this because they currently do have, for long-standing historical reasons, much higher tariffs against the US than the US has against them. If it's starting to talk about VAT, which we know from Bob Lighthizer book, advisor to Donald Trump, he cares very deeply about, then that could be another really big bill for Europe. And of course, we're calculating on top of that how much it would cost them to do all the stuff on defence that he wants. So this is shaping up to be a very expensive period for European governments if they take him at his word.
But is this a tool to negotiate, or does he also just want to get revenue for the US economy?
I think when he starts talking about the reciprocity, although it's very complicated, you could see against an area like the European Union, there are very big numbers involved in terms of the amount of trade that goes transatlantic. And that does feel to me like a way of raising money, so as less of a negotiating ploy than a way of, what in his terms, levelling the playing field. There's been a long-standing feeling that VAT was a tax on US exporters in Europe and a subsidy for European exporters to the US.
I mean, there's defence spending and there's also the cost of rebuilding Ukraine. and it's unclear, from the past couple of days what the U.S. position with Putin really is.
Well, and I think we've seen, if we just take at face value some of the things that President Trump appears to have said on his call, and what he's been saying in his messages to Europe is that they will not be paying for any of the US will not be paying for very much of it. There's a lot of different numbers flying around. We're certainly talking about hundreds of billions, maybe 200 or 300 billion for starters for the reconstruction of Ukraine. But if you don't have, I think people here, particularly at the Munich Security Conference, are very focused on the security of Ukraine first, because everything else follows from that. What are the security guarantees and who is going to provide them?
Yeah, and we're 2 weeks away from this German election. And I think J.D. Vance was saying, look, European leaders also have to, if not engulf, try and, promote free speech. And that includes the far-right parties. What does that mean? Yeah,
and we've seen that. I mean, of course, there was a lot of criticism of Elon Musk, who's the sort of unelected member of the administration, intervening in German politics earlier in the campaign. But to have J.D. Vance effectively also say, to try to speak to the German people over the heads of the leaders and say, you should be strong enough to take anything that comes through social media. You shouldn't be frightened of the views of your people. I think that too is something that is really scrambling European circuits. And we should remember that over this weekend it's going to be the first time that Alternative für Deutschland is in a televised debate. So it's quite a moment for him to be talking about listening to their voice.
And Stephanie, what's the UK thinking right now? So how can they, bridge maybe a gap between Europe and the US, or do they just go it alone and try and find a bilateral with the US?
I think it's very difficult, certainly on the defence grounds, to genuinely go it alone, because they feel very strongly, and of course the UK has been one of the strongest partners for Ukraine from the start, under Boris Johnson and under others. But you do see, both on defence and on Europe, and on the tariffs, that the language coming from the UK is somewhat different. I think they feel they have a way of talking to Donald Trump, which is a sort of, that's an interesting argument, let's see about that, does it really apply to the UK, rather than the flat-out response that I think the European Union almost has to make because of the way it's designed. So I think you may find on things like tariffs that the UK does feel it's in a better place and will not be lining up with the Europeans. There won't be solidarity on that, but maybe more on Ukraine.
Stephanie, thank you so much. Stephanie Flanders there, who also has a great podcast called Trumponomics, and there's going to be a special edition from the Munich Security Conference. So I urge everyone to go and listen to that when it drops. Coming up, Apple's plan to bring its AI to China. We'll bring you the details next. This is Bloomberg. Alibaba's chairman says his company is one of the Chinese partners that Apple will use to bring AI technology to its iPhones in the region. Now, Robert Lee from our Bloomberg intelligence team joins us with the details. Hi, Robert. So how significant is this for both Alibaba and Apple?
Okay, well, it's clearly good for sentiment for both companies. If just address the points on Alibaba first. Alibaba is obviously most well known as being an e-commerce giant, both in China with various overseas operations as well. So if you look at their cloud business, it's slightly under 1/4 of their overall group revenue. And whilst I think there is some potential revenue upside, Apple is known for its tough negotiating stance. And I think probably the net impact on Alibaba's earnings is unlikely to be significant. You might not know that from the share price reaction, but in reality, I think it's a really, fairly marginal gain from them. On the Apple side, it's a step forward in terms of their China developments, but they are playing catch up. Most of the major Chinese brands have launched AI-enabled phones over the last 12 months or so. So Apple's actually coming from behind on that. But at least this development sort of clears the way for them to add Apple Intelligence into their China iPhones. And hopefully that should help stabilize their business. But it's a ruthless cutthroat market in China. So as to whether it ignites a new round of growth for them remains to be seen, and is probably, I would say, less than likely.
Robert, will Apple Intelligence actually help transform the iPhone makers' prospects in China?
Again, it's smartphones these days are commoditized. If we had this conversation 15 years ago when they were in the ascendant, that would be a very different outlook. But it's a commoditized technology. The local brands, in terms of their technological prowess, in terms of the functionality they offer, I mean, it's very, very strong. They're also very competitive on the cost front, and the software they offer and the apps are obviously more attuned to the local population. So obviously, it's a very tribal thing when it comes to smartphones. If you're probably on the Apple ecosystem, you're on it for life almost. So I think, they're down to that sort of level at the moment, but it's going to be a tough ask for them to grow their market share and grow their business, given the, intensely competitive dynamics of the China market. It's not easy out there.
No. Yeah, it certainly is not easy. Robert Lee from Bloomberg Intelligence. Thank you so much. Now, coming up, let me tell you, we have great interviews over the next half an hour. We discuss Europe, U.S. with the former French Prime Minister, Dominique de Villepin. That interview is next, and this is Bloomberg. Good morning, everyone, and welcome to The Pulse. I'm Francine Lacqua here in Munich, and these are your top stories. The future of Ukraine hangs in the balance here in Munich as European leaders consider their role in negotiations after Donald Trump's phone call to Vladimir Putin. A 50% cut in defense spending, Donald Trump floats the idea of a deal with Russia and China as a way to radically reduce military budgets. Plus, signs of tariff fatigue while Bloomberg's dollar index slides to two-month low as investors wind back bets that President Trump will ramp up levies. Now, Donald Trump has left European leaders scrambling for answers just weeks into his presidency. He's ordered tariffs on European steel and aluminium imports and is threatening more to come. He also blindsided the EU, saying he'd agreed to negotiate an end to the Ukraine war with Russian President Vladimir Putin. Now, while his defense secretary has said NATO membership for Ukraine was unrealistic. So lots to discuss with Dominique de Villepin. He's a former French Prime Minister and former Foreign Minister who joins us exclusively from Paris. Monsieur de Villepin, thank you so much for speaking to Bloomberg. Given everything that's happened over the last 5 days, given what Donald Trump has said was told in the in the phone call with Vladimir Putin, do you worry that the risk of a global conflict has just gotten bigger?
Well, yes, the risk exists. And it seems very much that the season part one on Ukraine is already finished. The declaration of Pete Hexit and the phone call between Donald Trump and Vladimir Putin has said and closed almost all the possible doors for a good outcome on Ukraine. All the red lines that Ukraine has put during the last years concerning, for example, the possibility to get back the territories, it seems very much that that's not on the table. The possibility to have American troops on the ground, it's not on the table. The possibility for Ukraine to have a NATO guarantee is not on the table. So very much it looks like part one is finished, and now it's a matter of knowing what can the Europeans do, what can Ukraine do, what can Ukraine do with the European, but I think we are not going to have some very nice surprises coming from the US.
Yeah. But Monsieur de Villepin, to just be very clear, do you think the US plan on Ukraine is the only viable plan? Do you think Russia should rejoin the G7? And do you think Ukraine needs to forget about joining NATO?
I think that it shows very clearly that the US Trump administration has no ideas on Ukraine, no willingness to defend the interest of Ukraine, and is only interested by some big geopolitical plan. He wants to have a photo with Vladimir Putin. He wants to have some nice move like Vladimir Putin going back into the G7. But this is not going to change the reality of the Russian policy towards Ukraine, and not change the fact that in 2022 we have been going through a Russian aggression towards Ukraine. So I don't see any kind of solutions to the problems we are facing in Ukraine. It is like just closing the parentheses, just like closing the eyes on the reality and forgetting about this reality. It's a totally virtual game. And it shows that the US don't want anymore to cope with the European issues. The US wants to go and address the China issue. And of course, now it's up to the Europeans to take their destiny into their hand and help Ukraine.
But so what is the way forward for Europe? Do you think the US is still a reliable ally for Europe? And what's the right thing to do for Europe? Does Europe even have the money to put up for the $3 trillion that would be needed in defense and rebuilding over the next 10 years?
I think in the last weeks we had the answers. The US administration doesn't want to have the attitude of an ally. They don't want to pay the price for friendship, and I don't think anymore in US foreign policy the paradigm of democracy and values is anymore at the center of their concern. The main paradigm for US policy is the America's interest and dollar. Everything is guided by the single interest of the US, and not anymore by the idea of having a role to play towards the world, having a role to guarantee peace around the world. So it is a huge and main change for world policies, and everybody has to take the lessons. For Europe, it is the opening of a new chapter, and they have no other way than to write their own story from now. Of course, it's very costly. Of course, it's very painful. But this has been on the table for many years now. And I'm very enraged by the fact that not as many Europeans has been clear-sighted enough to take the lessons before, because all this was written. And now we have to face realities.
Monsieur de Villepin, how seriously do you take Trump's plan for Gaza, and what can Arab countries do to prevent it?
I think that the same situation we are seeing in Ukraine, we are seeing it in Gaza. Donald Trump doesn't care about the Ukrainian people. He doesn't care about the European. And he doesn't care about the Palestinians. And he doesn't care about the Arab countries. He cares about his master plan to have Israel signing an agreement of normalization under the Abraham Accord with Saudi Arabia. That is the master plan. That is in the interest of what he believes is the interest of the US. But of course, this is not going to bring more stability for the region. This is not going to bring an answer for more justice given to the Palestinian. So we are again in the Middle East, in the situation where the Europeans, the world community has to react. A unilateral plan, a US unilateral plan in line with Benjamin Netanyahu is going to have the same kind of consequences than the Bush plan in 2003 invading Iraq. You see, the first plan of Bush was based on the idea of use of military force. The plan of Donald Trump is to use power politics unilaterally. You cannot create peace in the Middle East without including everybody, without including an idea of justice, without respecting international law.
Monsieur de Villepin, thank you so much for joining us today for this exclusive, important conversation. That was, of course, Dominique de Villepin, the former French Prime Minister. Now, coming up, we'll have plenty more from the Munich Security Conference. We'll speak to Singapore's defense minister here at MSC as Donald Trump's return to the White House reshapes global geopolitics. This is Bloomberg. Coming in 10 seconds. Welcome back, everyone. Now, Donald Trump is looming large over the Munich Security Conference, even though he's not attending in person. Now, leaders are meeting here as the U.S. president seeks an end to the war in Ukraine, floats a deal with Russia and China to cut defense spending, and suggests that Moscow is brought back into the G7. Well, we're now joined by Anja, the Singaporean defense minister. Minister, thank you so much for joining us. Look, it's quite a very important historical week. That's what it feels like.
Yes, it is.
What does it mean for geopolitics in Asia?
Well, for small states like Singapore, we've always felt that the big powers will have to decide. We have some agency, but neither do we believe that we have full sway over events. So I think for Asia, it is still the U.S.-China contestation that will affect us.
But, Minister, when you look at the Europe and the U.S. and what they're trying to do, there seems to be an underlying current of maybe he just wants to deal with Ukraine so that he can focus on Asia more. Is that how you read foreign policy this week?
Well, that's what the U.S. has said openly. And I've been talking to European leaders. Everyone agrees that the peace process needs to begin, and peace is a good idea for everyone. What's unsettled is the security guarantees for Ukraine and how to make sure that the aggression that Russia showed isn't repeated after the peace ensues. And for the impact on China, American policy has always been that, quote unquote, China is a pacing threat. And in terms of disposition of forces, the U.S. already pre-positioned more troops and assets into Asia, so that isn't really very different.
But can you give us a sense of how you're interpreting, his latest comments or what we've heard so far on Taiwan and the South China Sea?
I think neither U.S. nor China want to go to war over Taiwan. I think the U.S. recognizes that Taiwan is a deep red line for China, and we're in a better position, I think, when we were compared to 1 or 2 years ago. For South China Sea, we have to be careful, but I think there is less reason for casus belli. So I think if heads hold on steady and we agree on a modus vivendi, a sort of accommodation, and hope that time will ease the passage of both big powers, I think that's not a bad position.
Are you more optimistic or more pessimistic than you were 3 weeks ago after all the current developments?
It's certainly unpredictable. I think the biggest question on everyone's mind, and this is from the conversations I had with European leaders, is how U.S. has changed. It is now in the 60s and 70s, even for Europe and Asia, the U.S. was portrayed as a liberator, whether it's against Hitler's Nazis party or communism or other forces. Now U.S. is seen as a great disruptor. And how do you come to terms with new conditions? There is certainly a level of unpredictability that hasn't been seen before, but one hopes that doesn't lead to instability.
Minister, what's your take again on some of the reciprocal tariffs? Right? I mean, this has an impact on a lot of smaller Asian economies. And do you see that linked to defense?
Always. There's a dictum that trade and security are two faces of the same coin. And if your trade alliances shift or change, usually the security alliances will follow. if you talk to economists, they're not quite convinced that tariffs will solve many problems of the U.S. is facing. Remember, this is the richest nation that has benefited from globalization, and yet it wants to rewrite the rules for trade. It is what it is, and let's just watch. For Singapore, we're in a better position. We buy more from the U.S. than we sell. So that's been positive. And under President Trump, his first term, we signed a memorandum of understanding to extend the use of our bases, to rotate through them. So I think we're in a good position, and we will continue to seek to deepen the ties. I had a very good conversation with Secretary Hegseth, and I hope there was a meeting of minds and aspirations.
So it doesn't necessarily bring security back at the forefront, or security concerns back at the forefront.
For Asia?
For Asia.
Oh, security is always there. I mean, because the risk of contestation, conflict between U.S. and China will be devastating. I've said that again and again, and you really don't want to go there. And your question, are we in a better position? It's a question mark. Yeah. Let's early days yet.
Minister, I know also the Prime Minister will deliver his budget in the next couple of days. What are you expecting for defense?
We have kept pace with our growth, and we're spending about 3% in GDP for our defense budget. We think that we'll continue to do that for this decade, barring unforeseen circumstances.
And procurement? I know there's been like F-35s. Will it be more or less similar?
We have already put in our orders for F-35As and Bs. We are in need of replacement of some platforms, but I'll announce it during Committee of Supply. But this is an ongoing exercise, and as long as Parliament approves my budget, we'll continue to modernize our military.
Minister, thank you so much for joining us. That was Anja Hen, the Singapore Defense Minister. Coming up, we'll talk a lot more, of course, of defense and security here from the Munich Security Conference. Donald Trump orders officials to consider imposing reciprocal tariffs on numerous trading partners. For more on this, we'll be speaking to Valdis Dombrovskis, the Economy Commissioner of the European Commission. He joins us next, and this is Bloomberg. So Donald Trump has ordered his administration to consider imposing reciprocal tariffs on numerous trading partners, including, of course, the European Union. Valdis Dombrovskis, European Commissioner for the Economy and Productivity, joins us now. Commissioner, thank you so much, as always, for giving us a little bit of your busy schedule. When you look at what Donald Trump has announced so far in terms of tariffs on steel and aluminium, the European Union always said, look, we can fight back. What would that look like?
Indeed, we are following closely the announcements of Trump administration as regards tariffs, and generally speaking, we are obviously disappointed. We do not see the basis for those tariffs, neither economically nor legally. The EU-US is having the largest trade and investment relationship in the world. We have deeply interconnected value chains, so all this is going to be quite disruptive economically. So we are in engagement with the US administration also to find more precisely the plans to find the constructive ways forward. But if necessary, we are ready to defend our economic interests and to respond in a firm and proportionate way.
So, Commissioner, first of all, have you run the numbers of what that looks like? If there were the first wave of tariffs and if there's then reciprocal and backwards and forwards, what that does to GDP, or just in terms of how much that would cost?
Of course, it will depend on exact policies which are going to be enacted. In a sense, also on the U.S. side, there are still some considerations how these reciprocal tariffs are going to be applied. But the EU is already having actually one of the largest tariffs in the world, one of the lowest tariffs in the world, sorry for that. So we do not see the economic reasoning for this as well. But obviously, we are looking, so what our options are. And if you remember also from the first Trump administration, when it imposed the tariffs on steel and aluminium, we responded with our tariffs in a proportionate way.
Do you think it would be similar to what happened last time, or are there new regions of the economy that would be worse affected?
We see that there has been already announcement on steel and aluminium, and what is being discussed now with so-called reciprocal tariffs, it goes beyond this, so it can be broader than last time.
Commissioner, there's also been very little progress on defense spending from the EU. What are you expecting J.D. Vance in his big speech today to announce, and how can Europe step up?
Well, I think it's very clear also from recent announcements from U.S. administrations that EU has to step up its defense effort, defense spending, strengthening our own military industry, strengthening support for Ukraine, because obviously it's key that we achieve a peace in Europe and peace in Ukraine that is fair and lasting, and that it's not done behind Ukraine's back, but with Ukraine at the table. So, but it's clear that we will have to do more as Europeans. And actually, European Commission is preparing for next month's the white paper on the future of European defense, where we'll be elaborating exactly on those issues.
Joint debt? Is this a possibility?
Well, I will not go now in detail, but it's clear that defense spending will need to increase substantially both at national and at EU level.
Commissioner, some have floated the idea that the frozen Russian assets, could then be spent by Ukraine to buy US weapons. Is that a good idea?
Well, we know that right now the frozen Russian assets or immobilized Russian assets are being used, the proceeds from those assets are being used for extraordinary revenue acceleration loan, which is provided by G7 to Ukraine, in a sense to repay that loan. So if there are new initiatives being discussed, and obviously we're looking at all the possibilities and all the implications, because eventually it is important that Russia as an aggressor is paying for the damage which is creating in Ukraine.
But would it be possible that one day this money would be used to buy U.S. weapons to get U.S. on side?
That certainly all will require more discussions and engagements also with U.S. administrations. But as I said, we are assessing different possible options how to move forward. But it's worth keeping in mind that right now those assets are used as a revenue source for repayment of this extraordinary revenues acceleration loan, which is being provided for Ukraine. So in a sense, Russia is already paying in this way for the damage it's creating.
Commissioner, just a very quick final question on regulation. Do you think the EU will follow the US in regulating less, but also getting rid of some of what's in place now?
Well, we have been very clear from our side that we are not in deregulation. So we will not launch some kind of deregulation race here. What we are doing a simplification without abolishing our high social and environmental standards. We set a numerical target for how much administrative burden we want to reduce by 25% in general and by 35% for SMEs. But we are not, for example, abolishing the goals of European Green Deal, like carbon neutrality by 2050 and so on. We are rather looking how we can reach our policy goals in a more efficient and less costly manner.
Thank you so much, Commissioner, for joining us. That was Valdis Dombrovskis, European Commissioner for the Economy and Productivity. Now, we'll have plenty more from the Munich Security Conference all day, and then don't miss our panel here on the future of U.S.-Ukraine security cooperation. That will be with the Ukrainian President, Vladimir Zelensky, and U.S. senators, including Lindsey Graham, Jeanne Shaheen, and John Cornyn. This is Bloomberg.